Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History by podcast. Today, I'm joined by Ross K. Nichols. How are you doing today, Ross?
I'm doing great, Jacob. Thanks for having me, man.
Of course. Ross Nichols is an independent biblical researcher, author, and educator. He has published 3 books through Horeb Press: The Moses Scroll, Fragments of a Leather Manuscript containing Moses' last words to the children of Israel, and These Are the Words, Essential Biblical Hebrew Vocabularies. You can find his books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other booksellers. Nichols has traveled extensively to Israel and Jordan over the past decade, leading tours and conducting biblical research. His primary research interests include the Hebrew Bible, emphasizing the Pentateuch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and 19th century explorations and discoveries in the Levant. He has participated in archaeological excavations in Jerusalem and biblical Tamar, south of the Dead Sea, and expeditions to identify the locations mentioned in the wilderness itineraries, including the quest for biblical Horeb Sinai. Nichols is a vice president and an ordained minister of the Hebrew Faith for United Israel World Union, an educational nonprofit organization founded in 1944. Videos of his weekly classes and biblical studies are live streamed to a growing global audience on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Audio archives of his biblical teachings are available on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and most major podcast directories. Search for United Israel by Ross K. Nichols and subscribe. And this next slide here is the fragments of a leather manuscript in the Moses Scroll on Amazon, of course, as I was discussing a moment ago. But yes, again, welcome to the podcast, Ross.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here, Jacob. I'm glad to join you, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. I think it'd be pretty interesting as we sort of unfold this. I wanted to maybe tell your viewers a little bit about how it came to be. How did the book come to be?
Sure.
What actually, because I wasn't an author, I had never written a book, but what actually compelled me to write this story, I had begun an investigation back in 2018. I guess you would call it sort of a historical, critical view of the Pentateuch. You know, I had become, I actually was exposed to some of the critical thinking, some of the academic works out there, having grown up in fundamentalism. And it wasn't that my world was shaken, but I certainly got into some things that caused me to question some of the thoughts that I grew up with, basically. You know, you read the text of the Pentateuch and you read about various things that scholars propose could not have been written by Moses. In fact, before we went live, I looked at the YouTube chat and you already had a question. Somebody was challenging the fact that Moses may not even be a historical person. So that field of study was new to me in a way. And so I began to read the Pentateuch through these critical, analytical eyes, if you will. So I began to question things that other scholars had proposed, like, you know, did Moses write the Pentateuch as traditionalists claim? You know, we have this idea that, you know, in Deuteronomy chapter 34, it talks about the death and burial of Moses. Well, is that something that we think Moses wrote? You know, people begin to question the fact that Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34:12, you know, is that or is that not something that's written by Moses? A couple of other questions. Would the meekest man on all the earth say something like Moses is the meekest man on all the earth? The geography. For instance, in Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 1 tells where the scroll is written. And in fact, if I can, do you mind? Can I just jump in there and read that passage?
Sure.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 1. This is one of the things that really got me thinking, and I'm building a case as to why I would write a book. So Deuteronomy 1, These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan. Well, we know from the storyline in the Pentateuch that Moses never crossed west of the Jordan. So whoever is writing this, first of all, is writing from the west, because they're telling us, the narrator is telling us that these are the words that Moses spoke on the other side. So whoever wrote this is west of the Jordan. That presents some problems. And so you begin to chip away at this fundamentalist view that Moses wrote every detail. Again, he probably didn't write about his own death. And then the other thing that really struck me, and other scholars have pointed this out, is the fact that we have a lot of third-person narration. In other words, in Genesis, we don't even know Moses, but we meet Moses in Exodus, early in the book of Exodus. But everything we read from Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers is in the third person. The Lord spoke unto Moses, etc. And so the idea put forth by scholars is that Moses didn't write any of this. And the more you get into academic scholarship on the Pentateuch and the composition of the Pentateuch, that becomes the key question. People can go as far back as to say, did Moses even exist? But if you're searching for what did he write, most would rule out all the third person. Well, one of the things that's interesting in that is that we do get from the biblical text that Moses did, in fact, write a scroll, and that's in Deuteronomy 31. I'm a Bible guy, Jacob, so I'm going to be pulling up some Bible passages here and there.
Sure.
So in Deuteronomy chapter 31, it says in verse 9, Moses wrote down the teaching, in Hebrew it's Torah, and gave it to the priests, sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the Lord's covenant, and to all the elders of Israel. So a fundamentalist, an apologist will say, hey, look, that's what Moses wrote. It says right there, he wrote the Torah. So one of the things that certainly was something I looked at. But then when you get to verse 24, it says, when Moses had put down in writing the words of this Torah to the very end, he gave Moses charged the Levites who carried the ark, saying, take this book of the teaching, place it mitzad Aaron, beside the ark of the covenant, and let it remain there as a witness against you. So there, again, a fundamentalist would say, hey, this is proof that Moses wrote the Torah. But again, it's written in the third person. So we have these passages which suggest that Moses wrote a scroll. But here's something that hit me. And I see the graphic on the screen. I'll get to that in just a moment. But what really struck me about this is third person narration. It's telling us that Moses actually wrote a scroll. But the thing that really stands out is that it says he wrote it until the very end, and we're only in chapter 31. We still have 3 chapters of Deuteronomy. So I began to look for if there's any evidence for the little scroll that Moses wrote that Deuteronomy talks about. Is there anything to this? So I began to search the scriptures. There are 7 references in the Pentateuch to Moses writing something. So I began to sketch out an idea that possibly later narrators are giving us some information that maybe we need to follow up on. So if you look at what are those things that the Bible or the Pentateuch tells us Moses wrote, and you begin to get sort of an outline of what it might have looked for. So just quickly to recap a couple of things, excuse me, leading up to the writing of this book. There is in 2 Kings 22 and 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35, a discovery in the days of Josiah. And in that, most academics look at that and they say, it's interesting. This passage tells us that a scroll was discovered, and the academic community says based on the descriptions that are given in those passages, it looks like it was a version of the book of Deuteronomy. So in April, I gave a talk called Finding the Hand of Moses, the Torah Within Our Torah. And by May, I was writing a book. And then my world was shaken in December. I know you've interviewed Dr. James Tabor on your podcast a few times. He and I have been friends for a couple of decades now. He wrote me an email, sent it to me and a couple of our associates, and it was an article out of the Harvard Gazette, Jacob, and it was about an author by the name of Hanan Tigay, who had written The Lost Book of Moses, The Hunt for the World's Oldest Bible. So Tabor wrote me and he said, "Hey, you ever hear about this guy or this book?" And I hadn't. So immediately we jumped into this. We both ordered the book. We read through it. And at the time, Tabor was working on several other projects. And so he couldn't devote himself full time to it. But I just got enamored with the whole story. It literally knocked me off my feet. And so I began to look at everything that Tigay presented. And by the way, he tells the story that we're going to talk about today about Moses Shapira and a manuscript that he presented to the world in 1883, which was ultimately called a forgery. So the first thing I had to do after I worked through Tigay was I had to process all of the material. And by the way, Tigay is a brilliant writer. He is an award-winning journalist and a professor of creative writing at the University of San Francisco. But he left me with questions. You know, there were all these facts about this manuscript, but he didn't include the manuscript. So I remember thinking, what did the manuscript say? Because I had already sort of penciled in what I thought the manuscript might say if we were able to discover the actual manuscript that Moses wrote. And I understand that the skeptical view is that, well, again, maybe Moses didn't even exist, but work with me here. This was my thinking. So I began to really delve into this story that took place in the late 19th century. And so I'm not going to ignore previous investigators. So I looked at all the clues. John Marco Allegro had written a book in 1965 called The Shapira Affair. All the investigators who've ever delved into this subject have looked at that particular work, and they've looked at Miriam Harry, who is a daughter of Shapira. She wrote a book called Little Daughter of Jerusalem. We have modern investigators, Yoram Sabo, Matthew Hamilton, Shlomo Gill, Fred Reiner, just to name a few. And there's an author by the name, a scholar by the name of Menachem Mansour, who in 1956 wrote a very interesting piece. Now, I'll tell you, I think your listeners and viewers will probably understand why it came out after 46 and 47. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he wrote a book about reevaluating the Shapira manuscripts, and he even refers to them as Shapira's Deuteronomy Dead Sea Scroll. So I began a deep dive. Now we're talking 2019, right after December's email came through. So I'm looking into every newspaper article I can find, every journal article that I could come up with. I was very, very deep into the archives of the PEF. I started working in German materials. By the way, I'm not fluent in German. In fact, I'm very poor. I'm taking classes online to learn a little bit of German, but we were translating documents in German or from German and French into English just to begin to get my hands around these documents, you know. Here's the basic story, Jacob, that pertains to the scroll. In 1878, Shapira acquires 16 leather strips. I see on the screen you're showing, this is from a drawing that was put forward. Christian David Ginsburg commissioned this and had an expert pull these, make these drawings. They supposedly represent one of the 16 fragments. This would be fragment E, and it contains, remember, Hebrews right to left, so on the right, in that right-hand column, this is an artist representation. We unfortunately don't have any photographs, but it's an artist representation of a text which turns out to include the Shema, but it's got a different reading, by the way. And then column 2, going right to left, 3 and 4, contain a version of the 10 commandments, or the 10 words as they're called in Hebrew. So Shapira brings this forward to the world, to Europe, in 1883. Scholars examine this document and they reject it. They call it a forgery for many reasons, and we'll get into that. This is the typical story, the way it's told. So he's rejected and he's depressed, and this is what they say. He goes into Europe, he wanders around Europe, ultimately ending up in the Netherlands. And then in March, according to the typical narrative, he kills himself in a hotel in Rotterdam. Now, what were the objections of the scholars in the 19th century? What they said, Jacob, there were quite a few objections. The main one was this, that there's no way that a leather manuscript would survive for thousands of years in a cave by the Dead Sea area, in the Judean desert. They just didn't believe that it could possibly happen. Another one of the disagreements, or one of the challenges to the authenticity, was that this followed on the heels, this discovery, 1883 is when it comes to light, really, but it follows 1868, the Mesha stone, or the Moabite stela, was discovered, and the paleography, the letter forms, look similar to, though not exact, to what we see in the Mesha stela. And there it is on the screen. I see that. So what they began to do is they said, wait a minute, these are the scholars in 1883. They said, we know what this guy did. Even if they didn't come out and say it was Shapira, they said the forger knows about this paleo and just wanted to make it look like this is an ancient document. So they gambled, they guessed, and the forger made it, used letter forms from the Moabite stela, and voila, they produce a manuscript. Another thing that was working against Shapira is that he had been involved in a case that is called the Moabitic scandal. That's what I call it. And it involves some discoveries on the heels of the Mesha stela, where quite a few Moabite objects were brought from the sands of Moab, allegedly, and sold. They passed through Shapira's hands. So the thinking was, because ultimately they were called forgeries, the thinking was, wait a minute, you've got Shapira again. He's been associated with forgeries from Moab. Now you're telling me that a scroll that was discovered in the land of Moab passing through Shapira's hands? Come on, you see what I'm saying? So they began to think, well, once a forger, always a forger. And in fact, the same person, a scholar by the name of Charles Clermont-Ganneau from France, who had led the charge of forgery with the Moabitica, also was involved in bringing down the hammer on the Shapira documents. But something happens in 1946 and 47 that really brought this thing to the fore again. Some Bedouin, as you know the story, discovered a scroll are several scrolls in what is now called Cave 1 at Qumran. Now, interestingly enough, Jacob, when that discovery was announced and they're searching for someone to, Trevor and some of these guys are looking for people to help them analyze these scrolls and so forth. One of the initial objections to getting involved with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was this: wait a minute, this sounds it's uncanny how similar this story sounds to the Shapira story. So there are 3 or 4 accounts in the records, I include these in the book, where scholars were a little bit anxious to get involved because they didn't want to be labeled nuts, because of the Shapira story. But what happens is that in 1956, Menachem Mansour from Wisconsin launches an effort to reevaluate the Shapira story. And when he does this, he brings forward the evidence, the similarities between the discovery story and various elements of the scroll itself that he felt were worth checking into, because, like I said, Dead Sea Scrolls, very similar to this story. And so then you had several other peoples. I mentioned John Marco Allegro wrote a book. There was a scholar named Helen Jefferson. She wrote some reasons to reevaluate the scroll, and Teicher and some of these others. So I'm looking at all this material and I'm thinking about this call for reassessment. And one of the things that I realized is I absolutely need to go back and look at all the source material that's available. So again, I'm tearing through things that other investigators have looked at. In the British Library, there is a manuscript, sort of a dossier, called Papers Relative to M.W. Shapira's Forged Deuteronomy, 1883 to 84. It's known by the catalog number ADD manuscript 41294. It's a file, and it contains a lot of the newspaper articles and things relative to the case back in the 1800s. So I also looked at modern day investigators, people who had gone this way before, we might say. Tegay, obviously, was the one who introduced me to the subject. There's an Israeli investigator by the name of Yoram Sabo. I read his material. He did a video, and I'll give you these links later, Jacob, if you want to post them in the comments or something.
That'll be fine, yeah.
But the video that Yoram Sabo did was called Shapira and I. It's a documentary, very well put together. I would highly recommend it. He wrote a book that's available in Hebrew. The translation of the title of Yoram Sabo's book is The Scroll Merchant. A lot of people don't know this, but the current Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, his mother wrote a book called A Broken Vessel about Shapira and the Shapira affair. Again, we have Fred Reiner. He was a rabbi, brilliant scholar. Shlomo Gil. So I'm going through all of these, and then I came across an Australian by the name of Matthew Hamilton, who is hands down the world's authority on Shapira. And I've since come to know all of these people we call ourselves Shapira maniacs or Shapiraologists, those that are interested in the case of Shapira. But also in the research, I was pulled headlong into the 19th century, and I wanted to go through everything that was covered in the news. This is why I say that the book is reopening the most controversial case in the history of biblical scholarship, because every newspaper, I found things in the New York Times. It was in newspapers in England, the Athenaeum, the Times. It was in German, you name it. And so I found myself in all of these old documents, reading the story and sorting and assembling all this material over again. Now, one of the works, you showed the slide with the book. You have the Moses scroll, and then the book that is called Fragments of a Leather Manuscript, containing the last words, Moses' last words to the children of Israel. One of the things that I kept coming across was references to this German work produced in 1883 by two German scholars by the name of Hermann Goethe and Ed Meyer. And everything made me believe that I really should study this material. So it wasn't translated into English. So, Jacob, what I had to do was I was copying and pasting into Google Translate. You ever do that? Sometimes you don't get the exact way it should be translated, right?
Yeah, I've noticed that.
So the translation left a lot to be desired. And two of my friends and fellow researchers, the Tylers, Dave and Patty, they asked me, what can we do to help on this investigation? And I told them that I really needed this work translated into English because from what I could tell through Google Translate, this book blew wide open the case. In other words, there were things covered in this work that I really needed to read from an accurate translation. So the Tylers hired, through their company, one of the things that they have is a language institute, and they hired a young guy by the name of Mitchell Gold, a German specialist, and he and I worked together to translate for the first time this book. And what this book is, Jacob, it's an academic assessment. These two scholars were the only academics in the 19th century that published an academic treatise on Shapira's manuscript. So they get into everything from an academic standpoint. And so it's real important for investigators, and I'm glad that we have that published. It's available, as the slide shows, on Amazon for those who would like to get that. But I want to warn you, it is, I know your audience, a lot are academically inclined. It is an academic work. But I started putting together some timelines, and one of my main questions is, what does the text say? Remember, I tell you, Tagay doesn't include the text. He writes a brilliant work, but he doesn't tell me what the text says. So I began to search the internet, looking far and wide. What did the text say? And so that was one of the main things that I had on my plate. So what did I come out with? After a year of intense study, I came away with the view, and I'll be careful the way I say this, I know we'll have questions to field. I came away with this view that what we're dealing with here is both ancient and authentic. So I'm not saying that Shapira had in his possession the scroll that Moses wrote. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm suggesting is that this represents the earliest strata, in my view, of the Torah, if you will, from the hand of Moses. Now, I know that's an incredibly bold statement. I'll have to back up, I'm sure. But I came to my assessment for several reasons. Number one, the story checked out. One of the things that that Goethe writes is he heard the story and records a version of the story that Shapira gave him about the discovery, and he comes away with this. He questions in his writing. He said, "Who's going to go check up the details of this? How do we know that Shapira really, there's a Bedouin and this happened and this Bedouin tribe. But I went in and found historical sources that supported the story as Shapira told it. There are things that, this was another reason I arrived at a very positive view of this manuscript. And that is, there are things that Shapira could not have known in 1883. A lot of that, the lid gets blown off when the Bedouin tribesmen discover these manuscripts at Qumran. And then there are things that critical scholarship proves that they didn't know in 1883. And the question became, let me follow up on those. So just quickly, the things that really convinced me about the story. Shapira says that, now remember, he had a shop in, he immigrates to the land of Israel as a 25-year-old. So he arrives in Israel. This is Moses Shapira. He arrives in, he's born in 1830. He arrives in 1856. Now, along the way, in Budapest, en route, he's traveling with his grandfather. His father had made Aliyah years before, but his grandfather dies, we believe, on the way to the land of Israel. Shapira is comforted and convinced of the gospel in Budapest and converts to Christianity, according to the story. And when he arrives in the land of Israel, he joins the Anglican community at Christ Church. And shortly thereafter, he ends up sick and in the hospital, marries a woman by the name of Rosette Jockel, and they have two daughters. At some point during the 1860s, he opens a shop in Jerusalem, and he's got a sign out front. And the sign on Shapira's shop calls him a bookseller and an antiquarian. We have that slide. But it also says that he's a correspondent to the British Museum. So he's, as Yoram Sabo's book calls him, the scroll merchant. He's out shaking the leaves and going all over the world to Yemen and other places in the Middle East, and he's collecting manuscripts from these places. And ultimately, they make their way into the British Museum and the German, the museums and libraries in Germany as well. But when I talk about the story checking out, he mentions that the person who tells him the story initially about the scroll is an Arab by the name of Sheikh Erakat. Sheikh Erakat is from Abu Dis, and he tells a story that in 1878, Sheikh Erakat in the summer comes to visit him at his shop, and he brings an entourage of Arabs with him. And when they have their discussion, and during the discussion, one of the Arabs in the group says, you know, there's this story about a manuscript that was discovered in the land of Moab. And they begin to tell him the story about this scroll. What we now know is that the Sheikh Erakat was from Abu Dis, is well known in historical sources as someone who was very connected with those east of the Jordan. So I find that piece of the story checks out. The scroll is discovered, according to the stories, high in the Wadi Mujib in a cave. And the way it goes is that Bedouin were fleeing from their enemies about the year 1865. And they seek refuge in this cave. And when they go into the cave, they find at the back of the cave, Jacob, like some old rags that are wrapped up. They think they're treasure. So they quickly peel them open. And when they get inside, they don't find gold, but what they find are old blackened leather strips with ancient writing on it. And so they didn't know what they were, but the story goes that they threw them away, just cast them aside. And ultimately, one of these Bedouin picks up the manuscript strips and brings them back to his tent and becomes wealthy, had them in his possession for a little over a decade. These are the strips that come forward in our story. So again, we verified that in around 1865, the Pasha, the Ottoman ruler, was really cracking down on the Bedouin. And so ultimately what happens is the story is set, and it makes sense that Bedouin would be fleeing from their enemies, the Ottoman authorities, and that's where they found this particular scroll. Now, the other thing that I find interesting about the text, you showed the slide earlier that shows one of Ginsberg's drawings that he had commissioned. The initial assessment was one of the reasons they believed that it was a forgery is that up until this comes forward in the late 19th century, they're not familiar with Paleo writing on anything other than lapidary, like the Mesha stones, statues, monuments, coins, something like that. But they hadn't discovered anything. Remember, this is 60 to 80 years before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we didn't have any scrolls that were written in Paleo. And there's another interesting thing about this manuscript, if the viewers can see, or again, we're doing right to left, beginning in column 2, if people can look closely, they might see dots between some of the characters. You don't have to know Paleo to notice it. What these are called, they're called interpunks. Again, the only place that these have ever been seen, certainly not in leather manuscripts, but on lapidary. The text of this manuscript goes, it's called scriptio continuum. There's no break between words. It's like just a continuous line of text. Sometimes at the end of a line, a word will be broken in the middle. The only place that we have word breaks is where interpunks occur. And those who believed that this was a forgery said, we've never seen this in leather. This forger wants to make us believe that it's ancient, because we do see these interpunks like on the Moabite stela and the Siloam inscription, which was discovered in 1880. So they thought that this was just a big hoax. Now, the manuscript was difficult to read. We have the testimony of Herman Gutta and Ed Meyer and Christian David Ginsberg and Shapira's testimony. And it's difficult to read because it's dark. You can even see in this drawing that in some places it's very dark. In other places it's not. They would have to use spirits, is the way Shapira described it, and Gutta described it the same way. They would take a brush and brush like alcohol onto the leather fragments, and sometime between the wetting and the drying, the letters would become visible on those hard to read places. Now, externally, I was very much drawn to the clues because it sounds a lot like Dead Sea Scrolls. It's found in a cave by Bedouin. It's wrapped in linen, coated in what was described at the time in the 1880s and also in the early 1946, 47, they talked about it being coated in like an asphalt or a pitch, bitumen. Both of these stories have the same thing. But you see, Shapira didn't know the story of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So how would he know to do that? He wouldn't have known that paleo was not used on leather and that interpunks were not used on leather documents. But now we know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have 13 documents that were discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are paleo. All 13 are works that are attributed to Moses, Torah-based works. And only in those 13 manuscripts do we find paleo writing with interpunks. Shapira could not have known that. The other thing, when we deal with the text, we have several internal things that make me believe that this represents an ancient, authentic document. First of all, this is a big one for me. It's only in the first person. In other words, it doesn't say, "And the Lord spoke unto Moses." It's first person, similar to what we find in places in Deuteronomy where it says, "The Lord spoke unto me," etc. It feels like it's written in the first person as if Moses wrote it. There are no anachronisms. Now, your viewers probably know what an anachronism is, but an anachronism is a clear sign that a non-contemporary writer is placing himself or herself in the text. I'll give you an example. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, it says, "The Canaanites were then in the land." Well, according to the biblical narrative, the Canaanites are in the land beyond the time of Moses. So the Canaanites, the land didn't rid of the Canaanites until after the conquest. So that's an anachronism. Someone is putting that in at a later point. The Shapira strips contain no anachronisms. The Shapira manuscript, instead of using the tetragrammaton to refer to God, it uses Elohim exclusively. The only exception is in the intro and the first verse and the last verse, which is clearly written by a later scribe. The geography is not confused. So what do we have? The manuscript that came into Shapira's possession in 1878 represents 16 leather strips. Now, you have on the screen 8 transcribed fragments. Now, I just said 16. What we have is, and this is something Shapira noted and others noted as well, what was preserved are 2 copies of the same manuscript, 42 columns of text. So you roughly have 21 columns of text twice. And the scroll, each copy of the scroll would have been about 11 feet long, about the size of the Bible's book of Hosea. It lacks one thing. People want to know, what does the text say? Of course, I have that in the book, but I'll give your listeners a little bit of a heads up. It lacks everything in what is called the law code of Deuteronomy, chapter 12 through 26. Now, why is that important? If you're a forger in the 19th century, and even today, by the way, many scholars believed that the earliest part of Deuteronomy is represented by the law code, chapter 12 through 26. It's believed, and it certainly was believed in 1883, the 1880s, to be the earliest form or the earliest part of Deuteronomy. Let me give you a couple of examples what chapter 12 through 26 contain that are not in the Moses scroll. Number one, there is no cult centralization. Scholars will often refer to Deuteronomy as the latest text, and some have referred to it as a pious fraud because it contains what people call the centralization of the cult. Chapter 12, chapter 17, they talk about bring your sacrifices to the place where God will put his name. But Deuteronomy is the only one that mentions that. You're not going to find that in Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers, only in Deuteronomy. And interestingly enough, that same idea is brought forward in the discovery of the scroll in Josiah's day. So scholars begin to think that, hey, wait a minute, the book of Deuteronomy was written to advance Josiah's reforms. So Josiah's trying to pull sacrifices to Jerusalem to centralize the cult, and so that's evidence that the book was not found in the days of Josiah, they would argue, but it was written at that time. A couple of other things that I go into in my classes and in the book to some degree is, you'll recall in Deuteronomy 17, verse 14 through 20, it talks about the monarchy. Now, what's interesting about the monarchy is if you read Deuteronomy 17, you have this idea that the Torah predicts that one day you'll come to the land that God's going to give you, and you're going to ask for a king like the nations. Well, when that happens, Jacob, in 1 Samuel 8 and following, guess who sounds surprised? Samuel sounds shocked. You would think that when the people say, hey, give us a king like the nations, Samuel would say, you know, I knew this day was coming because it says that in Deuteronomy, and here we are. I hoped it wouldn't happen, but here we are. He complains to God, which would be an excellent opportunity for God to say, hey, Samuel, don't be upset because we knew this day was coming, and here we are. But everyone acts surprised in the story, which leads scholars to believe that the monarchy was not put in until later. It certainly wasn't part of the scroll that Moses would have written. This document, Shapira's scroll, lacks all of that material from 12 through 26. So again, it's not what scholars would have expected from something that would claim to be old. It's the opposite. So a forger is not going to produce something that would raise questions, I wouldn't think. And then we get another interesting part, the 10 Commandments, known as Aseret HaDevrim in the Hebrew text. It's mentioned 3 times. Literally, it's translated the 10 words, but people often refer to it as the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments in this particular document are different than the Bible. Now, that shouldn't be a problem for students of the Bible because we have 2 copies of the 10 words in the Bible, Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5, and these 2 don't match. So we've got a different version in the Shapira manuscripts. It's close, just like Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 are, but it's different than even those are. One of the things that stands out, by the way, people disagree on how do you count the 10. The Catholics, the Lutherans, the Judaism, all have a different numbering system for the 10. And the reason for that is there's no clear way of distinguishing words 1 through 10. But in the Shapira manuscript, one of the things that's interesting is that every word, let's call them commandment, each commandment begins a new line on the text, and it ends with the phrase, Ani Elohim Elohecha. I am Elohim, your Elohim. And if you go down the list and you count them, it's very simple to come with 10. And we can talk in a few moments if you want about what those 10 are. They're in the book. But So I wanted to cover one other thing about the text. I know if you have questions, we can take a break in a minute and field some of those. But we have two groups basically that looked at the text in the 1800s. We had the Germans, Edward Meyer and Hermann Goethe. From July, the first week of July, 1883, Shapira brings the manuscript strips to the Hotel Hoffa in Leipzig, and they spend an entire week looking at the manuscript and taking notes and making a transcription, and they record all that in the book Fragments of a Leather Manuscript that we now have translated. And then after, and they produced, by the way, this book was a 95-page academic assessment that was published in Leipzig, but it doesn't come out until the 1st of September, 1883. Oh, let me comment on this. I see you pulled up the slide, fragment inventory chart, the 16 leather strips. Just so people understand what I'm talking about. If you count those little squares, you'll see that we have 42 little rectangles. And this is an inventory, just sort of a flow chart so you can see there were 5 of the fragment strips that were individual. In other words, they're not attached one to the next. So we have 5 single strips. We have 2 fragment strips of 2 columns each. We have 5 of 3, 5 fragment strips of 3 columns, 2 of 4, and then 2 of 5. Now, by the way, one of those strips with 4 columns is the one that Christian David Ginsburg had the artist produce and publish, which we showed a little while ago on the screen. That's one of those is fragment E. But again, remember, these 42 fragment pieces, these 16 strips represent 2 copies of the same manuscript. So Shapira brings it to Leipzig, brings the 16 leather strips. They're examined by Goethe and Meyer, and I'll tell you something about that in a few minutes. And then there's a quick meeting in Berlin. Shapira does not get a buyer, let's just say, in Germany. So he takes his scroll fragments and he goes to England. He goes to the office of the Palestine Exploration Fund, and he meets there. The secretary tells what he has, and ultimately Christian David Ginsburg is assigned after a couple of meetings of other scholars to examine the strips, and he does so in the month of August of 1883 at the British Museum. So what we had was, when I was researching, I realized that we had 2 independent transcriptions, meaning Hermann Goethe and Meyer looked at the text first week of August, and they produced a transcription. They didn't know what Ginsburg was doing. Ginsburg didn't know what they were doing. Ginsburg gets the manuscript strips in August of 1883, and he looks at the text, and over the period of August, in 3 installments in the paper called the Athenaeum, he publishes a transcription of the manuscript over a period of 3 publications. So what I wanted to do was produce a critical text where I would show both transcriptions together for the first time ever. And what I mean by that is, imagine I overlaid the text. So I began with Ginsburg because his was more complete. He saw things that Goethe and Meyer didn't record. But remember, he has almost a month. Goethe and Meyer only had a week. And the way I could show who saw what was where they agreed on what they were looking at, letter for letter. I produced that in my book in black in Hebrew. And where one saw something that the other transcription didn't record, or there was a variation, I put the text in gray. So what you have then is you can quickly look at what was obvious to the transcriber in the 19th century and what was not so obvious or questionable. And then, of course, in my book, I translated the Hebrew into English. Now, the thing that I wanted to point out about the phase in Germany, because most people who get into this story are familiar with the English, what happens in England, what happens in London in August of 1883. But very few delve into the German thing. And the only reason I'm able to do it is because of the Tylers and their hiring of Mitchell Gold and the book Fragments of a Leather Manuscript. What we found out when we read that book in English, and I'm guessing academics who've read the German already knew this, but I didn't know it, is that first of all, the published version says it's a forgery. So that wasn't a revelation. But there was another thing that people had told me about in their writings, and that is that there was a letter exchange mainly between Meyer, who was one of the ones looking at the scroll, a scholar by the name of Adolf Ehrman, and Meyer's teacher, mentor, George Ebers. We got those letters, Jacob, and we translated those letters. And what we found was that there was a unknown to most people. These scholars, they believed it was authentic. Adolf Ehrman, when he was brought into the mix to be shown at the Leipzig at the Hoffa Hotel, they bring Adolf Ehrman in, and we have copies of their letters. I have a chapter called The German Scholars where a lot of those letters are reproduced. I call them the Leipzig letters. They're back and forth. And one of the things that they say is, Adolf Ehrman says, if these aren't real, I'll eat these things. So the German scholars, Adolf Ehrman, Hermann Goethe, and Meyer believed they were authentic. But when they go to Berlin for the meeting in July the 10th, it's 90 minutes long. The decision was made beforehand that this can't be called real. We have a letter from Adolf Ehrman, who was in the room at the time. He writes Meyer and he says, hey, you need to cool it on how much you push this authenticity thing. It's not going to go well if you come out with an authentic decision. So ultimately, I think that the scholarly pressure caused them to come forward with a forgery verdict. But what they believe, what these letters reveal, is that there were believers at the time, and that pressure from their senior scholars caused them to say they were fake. Now, on the 24th of February, 2021, I published the Moses Scroll as a paperback. And, every author probably hopes that his book does well. I think I probably checked every few minutes to see if a copy sold. And then 2 weeks later to the day, I get a phone call from James Tabor. The Shapira story, Jacob, has hit the New York Times. 2 weeks after my book comes out. Now, you have to imagine, I get pretty excited. I think someone has read my book, and now there's a New York Times article about it. My book isn't mentioned. Nothing in the article suggests that the Moses Scroll has been published. This is a book it's about a book that was written by a Harvard fellow from the University of Potsdam in Germany in Berlin, basically Idan Dershowitz wrote a book, published his book called The Valediction of Moses, a proto-biblical book. Now, Dershowitz says that this is an ancient and authentic document, that it's not a forgery. And so you can imagine, I am thrilled to have someone in alignment with what my book says. And this book takes the academic world by storm. New York Times, it shakes the world. Immediately, within a day, the academic community begins to challenge the claims of Dershowitz. Now, here's what I find uncanny. I'd never heard of Idan Dershowitz, and you can bet he's never heard of me at this time. But if you take a look at our books, mine had 200, this is just cool stuff to me. Mine had 218 pages. Dershowitz's has 220. Mine tells the backstory. Idan's book tells the backstory. My book includes the Hebrew text of the Shapira scrolls. Idan's book contains the Hebrew text of the strips. My book has an English translation with notes. Dershowitz has an English translation with notes. Where they differ is that Idan, because of his approach, he's writing for the academic community. He gets into a lot more of the philological things, linguistics, that my book is written in a different way. But he has a philological analysis that he co-authored with another scholar by the name of Naama Patel. And they basically argue in that work that the manuscript exhibits textual things that put it clearly as an, I think the date he ascribes based on this philological analysis is like 957 BCE. So that's pretty far back, right? And you can imagine the academic world's going to challenge that. But one of the other things that he includes in his book that I did not know, and I'm happy to know it now, he discovered in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin 3 pages written by Shapira that were just like part of another work. In other words, he finds in this bibliothek, Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, a document that was basically just a list, a compilation of many lists of different manuscripts that Shapira had sold to the Berlin Library. And mixed in there, not even in order, in fact, it's actually backwards, there were 3 sheets that turn out to be Shapira's transcription of part of the Shapira strips. We call them the purple pages because they're written in purple ink. And what Idan argues very effectively, I'll add, is that these documents, these purple pages, prove that Shapira's not forging it. He's transcribing it, and he even shows that he's not sure about some of the readings. Now, the argument against that view is, well, he's just setting us up. He knew all along that he had faked it, but he wants to make it look not so obvious, so he puts all these other things in. But Idan's argument is quite convincing. Now we have 3 transcriptions, Jacob. We have the work published in Goethe and Meyer. We have Ginsberg's transcription, which was published in the Athenaeum in 1883 in the month of August, over 3 installments. And now we have Shapira's transcription of at least part of the manuscript, not all, but a good part of it. So people will often say, well, Ross, all of this sounds exciting, but it really doesn't matter because we don't have the manuscript. I would come back, Jacob, and say this. We haven't found the manuscript yet. But what we do have in our possession already is, what does the manuscript contain? What does it say? What does the manuscript consist of? What are the texts? And I've published a lot of these things on my academia page. In fact, one of the things that I recently put on my academia page is all of the 19th century transcriptions by line, by letter, by fragment. So a person who reads Hebrew can simply go download that document and they can read the manuscript straight off just like it is. So the question, I guess maybe you, Jacob, and everyone watching would be, where is it? I mean, where's the manuscript now? You know, some people have written me and said, hey, if you don't have it, you know, I don't even care. But so we're not without hope here. We have some clues. We know, for instance, thanks to Matthew Hamilton and Patricia Francis, who separately came on this discovery, the last known owner of the manuscript was named Philip Brooks Mason. Philip Brooks Mason lived in the late 1800s in Burton-on-Trent. We have a record, manuscript, a newspaper article that describes the last known sighting of Shapira's leather strips. And it's from March the 8th, 1889. There was a meeting that took place in the Burton-on-Trent meeting of the Natural History and Archaeological Society. And Philip Brooks Mason, the last known owner of the Shapira strips that we know of, gave a presentation that was called The Forgery of Shapira. The newspaper article comes out in the Burton newspaper, and it's from dated the 14th of March, 1889. And it says that at that meeting, he has the manuscripts there and the strips, and people were able to see them. So we know that that's the last place that they were seen. Now, a minute ago, you showed a note, a handwritten note, Jacob. If you could pull that up, I want to address that. After Shapira died, he died in the Netherlands in a hotel in Rotterdam. You'll see it's a handwritten note. There we go. And this particular note is, I'm sorry, I looked at it wrong, but this note is when Shapira leaves London. Now, after the manuscript was called a forgery in England, and it's all in the newspapers, Shapira sends this note, look, dear Dr. Ginsburg, dated 23 August 1883. I'm going to lean forward and read. You have made a fool of me by publishing, exhibiting things that you believe them to be false. I do not think that I will be able to survive this shame, although I am not yet convinced that the manuscript is a forgery unless Mr. Ganneau did it. I will leave London in a day or two for Berlin. Yours truly, M. Shapira. From this note, everybody gets the idea that Shapira is suicidal. He's been ridiculed, and it's all in the newspapers around the world that he brought forward a forgery. And so he leaves in shame and ultimately ends up in the Netherlands. But in the upper left-hand corner of this note, he's still writing, trying to justify that it's an authentic document. He's arguing a technical grammatical spelling point he's going against something that Ginsburg has published in that note. So he goes to Amsterdam, and he spends the last 6 months of his life there. And what's interesting about this is because of this note and the fact that 6 months later he's found dead in a hotel room, people believe that he's given up, that he no longer believes it's authentic. But that's not the case. We've shown in the book and in some of the articles that we've written that he's actually still selling documents to the British Museum. And by the way, Yoram Sabo points this out as well. Matthew Hamilton, other investigators have realized this. So he's not just depressed and wandering aimlessly through Europe. He's actually still trying to sell the manuscript. And one thing I was going to point out is that a discovery that I made when I was researching, a big question for people who study the Shapira saga is, why is he in the Netherlands? Well, what we discovered was, I did a Google search one night, thank goodness for Google. I said, I don't remember how I phrased it, but basically, Netherlands, 1884. And what I discovered was that in the fall of 83, there's like a World's Fair going on in the Netherlands. And in Leiden, not very far from Amsterdam, there is the 6th International Congress of Orientalists. Now, when I did research on this, I discovered that everybody who is anybody in the field of Semitic studies is at this 6th annual conference for the Orientalists. So my view is that Shapira is in the Netherlands partly because he wants to talk about his manuscript with the top scholars in the world. What we also have, and I didn't send you this photograph, but on the 28th of August, see, this one is dated the 23rd. The 28th of August, Shapira writes a letter to Bond at the museum. And what he tells him is, he said, please put this manuscript before other scholars. And then he uses great skill to counter every allegation of forgery that Ginsburg and Clermont-Ganneau had put forward to discredit the manuscript. So he writes this like 12-page letter arguing, please let other scholars look at it. So I think he's in the Netherlands for that reason, perhaps to find a buyer for his scroll. But be that as it may, on March the 8th, remember I said March 8th, 1889 was the last sighting of the scroll that's written about that I've been able to find. March the 8th or 9th, 1884, Shapira's in a hotel in Rotterdam. And the people at the hotel notice that they haven't seen him in a couple of days. So they go to the desk contacts the police go to the room, knock on the door, there's no answer. They bust open the door, and in the room, they find Shapira dead with a gunshot wound to the head. Now, the stories get a little bit interesting in that some of the accounts say he was on the bed, some say he's on the floor. It's just, it makes you want to look deeper into this whole story. But be that as it may, Shapira is dead. There are a few manuscripts in his possession, a couple of things that he's written, a business card, I believe, that says Moses Shapira, bookseller and antiquarian, correspondent to the British Museum. But the story is basically over, except that when news finally reaches Jerusalem, back to Rosette and little Miriam, that Moses is dead, of course, it's devastating news, because they thought during the heyday of this, when the scroll was first talked about in the newspapers in London, it looked like it was going to sell. In fact, it became, people often say, you'll hear quoted or read that Shapira asked £1 million for this document. And I think, again, that Matthew Hamilton, the authority, has basically proven that he didn't actually ask $1 million for it, but something was probably said, and this is the way I imagine it going, Jacob. Let's say Shapira said, you know, if this thing proves to be true, it's probably worth £1 million. And that people ran with that. It made it through all the press. So he's telling his family back home in letters, things are going well. On August the 14th, 1883, Prime Minister Gladstone came to view the document. I mean, he's on top of the world in the early days. But by the 23rd, he writes this note. So the book tells the story of what happened in those intervening days. But when he goes to the Netherlands, he leaves the manuscript behind. And so they still have 15 fragments. Now, you're going to say, well, I thought there were 16. Well, that's another part of the story. 15 fragments are left behind at the British Museum. And when Shapira dies and word gets back to Jerusalem, his wife writes a letter, and we have we don't have her letter. We have a note dated 7 July, 1884, and the letter is from Edward Bond at the British Museum. He's writing to Christian David Ginsburg, and he basically says, the widow Shapira has written me asking about her husband's manuscript. What that tells me is that the manuscript is still at the British Museum, and for some reason, I don't have to say what I think, it might be obvious in my tone, but Bond is telling Ginsburg, hey, there's questions about where it's at. And then the next thing we hear is the manuscript is sold at an auction. Remember, some suggested it could be worth £1 million if it were authentic. It sells for £20, or actually £10, 5 shillings at an auction. And the buyer's name was Bernard Quaritch, a bookseller in London. And what we have there, we know that they bought it in July of 1885. And then it falls off. We don't read anything about a sale. The last time we find it in the catalogs at Quaritch are September of 1888. Then the next time we see it is at the meeting in Burton-on-Trent in March of 89. So that means Philip Brooks Mason bought the manuscript between September of 1883 and March of 1889. Then the scroll, the trail goes cold, we might say. So we have a team, Jacob, that are looking for this particular manuscript, or I should say plural, the manuscript strips. We have 15 in London. We have 2 strips, or 1 strip with 2 pieces that I give away a little bit of a hint in my book as to where that might be. But right now we have a team of experts that are looking for this manuscript, the actual scroll strips themselves. We're leaving no stone unturned. We're primarily focused in Germany and England. And so I think that we're going to be doing quite a bit of travel. Last year, even during COVID, I traveled with the Tylers. We went to Berlin, we went to Leipzig, we went to England, spent some time at the PEF, spent time at the British Museum. And so we're really looking for these things. And I believe, I don't think it's just a desire. I want to believe that we're going to find these, and for a lot of reasons. Obviously, for one, it would settle for once and for all the question, are they ancient or are they not? You know, when you put scientific methods into play where they could test the DNA, you could find out real quickly, is this an ancient document, or does the goat skin date to 1876, let's say? You know, you could tell that pretty quickly. So that's one of the things. Now, what you've got on the screen now, by the way, Jacob, is a illustration that was published in France by Clermont-Ganneau. And here he is describing his theory, which, by the way, is the prevalent theory even today by those who say that the Shapira strips are forged. Notice that if you look at the top part, you'll see what is meant to represent a modern Torah scroll. And you see the margin at the bottom, the margin along the bottom where there's no writing. The first one to publish this theory is Charles Clermont-Ganneau, the Frenchman. He says that the forger cut that margin off from a scroll and then treated it with so many, you know, to make it look to be older than it was, and then wrote on this blank space this fake Moabite Deuteronomy, as it was called. So that's his theory. You can see what he's saying there. And by the way, that is the theory that Hanan Tigay takes in his book. He believes that he has proof that that's the way that it was done. And many people have put forward this theory, but it starts with Clermont-Ganneau. I don't even remember what other slides you have, Jacob. You can fire off questions or tell me what else you have.
There's a few more slides I don't think we looked at yet.
Okay.
But we could look at them a little later. There is a couple of super chat questions.
All right.
That was given a bit earlier. John D, thank you for your super chat. What do you think about a possible relationship between the Tempest Stele written during the expulsion of the Hyksos during Amos I, 18th dynasty, and the plagues of Egypt stories?
That's an excellent question. It's a little bit out of my field. I'm not so sure that I can adequately answer that. But I appreciate the question, and I'm gonna write this down and go look myself. I'm fascinated with the Egyptian angle.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Why is the scroll not in the Bible?
Good question. I'll say it in a couple of ways. One of the things is this scroll was, as I pointed out, deemed a forgery in the 1800s. And in a way, it appears that if it is authentic. So the question is, why is it not in the Bible? In some ways it is, but in a different form. I'll give you an example. This scroll, if you read it, is very similar in many ways to a form of the book of Deuteronomy. So it doesn't really look like it aligns very much with Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, but with Deuteronomy, it bears the most striking resemblance. In fact, from the beginning in the 1800s, when it comes forward, it's pitched to the world as the Deuteronomy from Moab. You know, it's a Deuteronomy manuscript. Now, it does have differences. And in fact, there are passages in the Moses scroll that do coincide with text other than Deuteronomy, like the story of the Moabites and the Midianites gets a space in this particular scroll, and that's not in Deuteronomy, at least in the form that we have it. But why is it not in the Bible? It's not in the Bible, because most people have considered it a forgery from the very beginning, And so no one's really given a close look at this. But what I'm suggesting is, for instance, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, we already, when you look at critical biblical scholarship, we have manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. Let's talk about the Hebrew Bible, or as Christians refer to it, the Old Testament. Particularly, I'm dealing with the Pentateuch, the 5 books. We have not only the Hebrew, the Masoretic text, which has been preserved by Judaism and is the basis for most people's Old Testament or Hebrew Bible today. We also have the Septuagint. We have versions of parts of these books from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the Qumran manuscripts, if you will. And they don't always agree. That's the work of textual criticism, to really kind of weigh those things out. What I would like to see is, first of all, if, and I always like to add, when we find these manuscripts, we have the tools now to date it and see how far back do we go. Let me just say it this way. Our Bibles today are based on manuscripts, the Masoretic text. The oldest complete version of the Hebrew Bible dates back to the 10th century of the Common Era, or AD, 10th century. That's the oldest. Now, with Qumran, you add Qumran in the mix, even though those documents don't always agree verbatim with the Masoretic text. We have documents that go back 2,200 years, 2,200 to 1,900 years. So that's a good jump, and it brings us back much further. But what would be interesting is to see if this is found, and if it tests and proves to be ancient and authentic, it would be incredible then to compare it. And I'm already doing this now, and Edun and other scholars are comparing it to what we already have in the text of the Masoretic text. But you can see, you can read the text in the book, and that'll get you started on kind of understanding what it has in it. But from a very broad or a high level, I would just say that it looks very close to Deuteronomy in many places. But again, chapter 12 through 26 is not represented at all in this manuscript. And let me add one other thing on that question, because a lot of people might say, well, then if it's missing chapter 12 through 26, why would that be interesting? One of the things that interests me about that is, if you read Deuteronomy chapter 11, Deuteronomy 11 is talking about the blessings and the curses. Moses is describing, when you go into the land, you're going to set up on these 2 mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and there you're going to pronounce the blessings and the curses. And what happens is that chapter 12 interrupts that and goes all the way through 26, just list after list of laws that aren't, in fact, it contains more than 100 laws in Deuteronomy 12 through 26 that we're not familiar with in the rest of the Pentateuch. And then chapter 27 picks right back up with the blessings and the curses. So it's almost like this chapter 12 through 26 is inserted between chapter 11 and 27, which read like flowing without 12 through 26. So it appears to be out of place. So I think that that's interesting. Jacob, you're showing now a wood cutting. This is one of the illustrations from my book. I should add that Daniel Wright is the illustrator. He designed the covers for my books as well as the illustrations, and he helped me clean some of these up. This is like an illustration from the 1880s in the British Museum. This is in the King's Library. When I went with Dave and Patty Tyler, we went in this room, and it looks just like this now. Obviously, the display tables and all are different, but it looks very similar. So that was sort of a thrill for me to go into the room and knowing what it looked like and having this drawing and seeing that it looks the same now in 2022 at the time when I went, 2021.
David Tyler, thank you for your massive super sticker. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brother Tyler. In fact, that's Dave Tyler's who I'm talking about. Dave and Patty are friends of mine, and they went. They're the ones who funded the translation of fragments of a leather manuscript, and they're the ones that brought me with them on all these fun adventures to England and Germany and Jordan and you name it.
That's amazing.
Yeah, Dave and Patty are part of the team, as well as James Tabor that you've interviewed, and many others that have helped along the way with this research. So I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is the potential. The hopeful. Some might say it's just a wing and a prayer, a hope. But I think it's more than that. I think we're really poised to go forward in this investigation with a decent probability of finding these manuscript strips. Just this week, I saw an article in Biblical Archaeology Review, the emails that they send out, like the Biblical Archaeology Daily email. They were talking about methods whereby you can read a text which is almost totally black, the different types of camera and so forth, that different types of technology that we can use now. See, they didn't have that in the 1800s. In fact, they tried to take photos of these scroll fragments, Jacob, and the text didn't show up. There are a couple of photos in the file, this ADD manuscript 41294 in the British Museum, but they took photographs and they put them in there, but you just couldn't read the writing. Remember, they had to, it's almost like invisible ink in places. In other places, we have accounts, contemporary accounts from the 1800s, where some said there were portions of the scroll that looked like it were freshly written. But other parts of the scroll where perhaps they were the coating of the bitumen or whatever that made it difficult, that bled through the leather, and so you couldn't really read it. But just in case I didn't make that point very well, when it was discovered, several of the leading scholars, a guy by the name of Archibald Sayce, Neubauer, Claude Conder, the famous soldier scholar from the British, these people that all came out against the authenticity, their biggest point was this, Jacob. You telling me, this is their question, you're telling me that a leather manuscript dating back thousands of years could survive in a cave near the Dead Sea? Well, it was laughable at the time. They even joked about it. Sayce says something to the effect that it wouldn't matter if you coated it with all the bitumen in the Dead Sea, it's not going to preserve it that well. So their thought is, and wait a minute, why does it have linen stuck to it? So I write about this in the book. At one point, they felt like it was written on mummy strips. Strange. Why would they think that? Well, because the strips are about 4 inches in height. Each column of text is about 6 inches. So these are about the size of a postcard, 4x6. And they're connected sometimes, as you showed in the diagram I sent you. There were 5 individuals, or 2 of 2, this many of 3, etc. But the idea is that you just couldn't, there's no way possible for people to come up with these things. There's no way. Yeah, let's leave that one up. Let me talk about that. This is, notice in Goethe's work, one of the things that Goethe's work did for us was it gave us the ability to figure out, he labeled the strips. So in his transcription, he finds, of all these different pieces, he finds the part that begins what seems to be a story similar to our Deuteronomy. You know, these are the words which Moses spoke. He finds one phrase in there and he puts that first and he labels it A. And he can only discern a few lines in that text. He finds another single strip, which seems to be the next logical following piece of the manuscript. Remember, we have two copies of this. He calls that B, C. Then you have H. Now, the reason this is just a layout to show you the breakdown of the strips. So you see you have A, B, C, skip a line, D. Fragment D has three columns, and these strip D has three columns of text, and that flows naturally in the order of the manuscript. Go down a couple, you'll see E. This is the one that Ginsberg had reproduced. He had the artist make that we showed the graphic of earlier. 4 columns of text, and it contains the Shema, hear, O Israel, but it doesn't say the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It says Elohim is our God, Elohim Echad. And then it's followed, notice the order is different than in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 6:4, you have the Shema, and the Shema follows the 10 words which were in Deuteronomy 5. In this manuscript, the order is reversed. Well, if you're a forger, why would you bring up things? Why would you introduce things that would just cause people to question the authenticity? In other words, if I'm going to fake a Deuteronomy, why wouldn't I just take bits and pieces of it, put it in an ancient script, and bring it before the world? This thing has all sorts of things that are different, textual differences, variants that a forger would be out of his mind to introduce. And anyway, so this, notice on fragment F, I have unavailable or unreadable for fragment strip column B, C, and D. What we get in Goethe's work, and Goethe and Meyer say Meyer actually had this strip. He says, all I can read are a couple of lines from fragment F. On strip F, column A. And we've had to reconstruct that. So I provide a little bit of what I think it might be, but there are three pieces of that strip there that I can't read because the people who saw it in their day couldn't read it. But here's why I bring this up. If we find these manuscript strips, modern technology could read where they couldn't read it in 1883. And then G contains the blessings and the curses. And then you go back up to A, which is sort of H, which is sort of the end of the document, as you might assume based on the lettering. Now, one thing that's different about this manuscript and Deuteronomy, if someone reads Deuteronomy chapter 27, it says, God speaking to Moses, and then Moses conveys this message on, when you cross into the land, you do this blessing and curse ritual on Mount Ebal in Gerizim, and he says, and then here's what it's going to look like. And he gives us, Deuteronomy 27 gives us the curses, but the blessings are missing. I had never really noticed that. The blessings are actually missing. Now, a lot of people will say, when I say that, they go, no, they're not. They're in chapter 28. And that's not what I'm talking about. If you read in Deuteronomy 27, it says, here's what the ceremony is going to look like. These people are going to stand on Mount Ebal, and they're going to say, cursed be, cursed be, cursed be, cursed be. All these curses will come upon you, etc. And then you don't get the blessed bees, which should be given on Gerizim, although he just said that was going to be part of the ceremony. What you get in 28 are the consequences of the blessings. So that's what we see there, but they're missing. But in the Moses scroll, interestingly enough, Jacob, not only do we have a list of blessings for Gerizim, which are absent in our Bible, but we've got the curses. Furthermore, the 10 words, the 10 commandments, which read differently in this manuscript than they do in Deuteronomy, which is no problem because Exodus and Deuteronomy's versions don't even match. But they're different, and not only are they different, the ones in the Moses scroll have a corresponding blessing and a curse. So I'll give you an example, and I have this in the back of my book, just sort of a handy little chart. And here's an example of what I mean. How about the theft, larceny? It says, "You shall not steal the property of your brother. I am Elohim, your Elohim." That's the commandment. The blessing, the corresponding blessing is, "Blessed is the man who does not wrong his neighbor," and all the people will respond and say amen. The curse is, "Cursed is the one who moves his neighbor's landmark," and all the people will respond and say amen. Here's another one. Look at the Sabbath. "Sanctify the seventh day. 6 days I made the heavens and the earth and all that's in them, and I ceased on the seventh day. Therefore you shall cease also, you, your animal, and all that's yours. I am Elohim, your Elohim." Now, one thing I'll point out on that, Jacob, is that's in the first person as God speaking. Whereas both versions we have in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, they're not in the first person. It says, and the Lord sanctified the Sabbath day, right? It's third person. This entire document, when God is speaking, it's first person. When Moses is speaking, it's first person. So sanctify the seventh day is a commandment. Here's the blessing. "Blessed is the man who sanctifies the seventh day and ceases their own." And all the people, they'll respond and say amen. The corresponding curse is, "Cursed is the man who does work on the seventh day to profane it," and all the people, they will respond and they'll say amen. This is the entire list of 10 commandments. Each have a corresponding blessing and curse associated with it. So that's one of the evidences, I think, that lends towards let's call it an earlier strata of the text, a text which comes before the time the Masoretic text comes, where by that point the blessings had been lost, that blessing part of the ceremony. By the way, the Talmud discusses this. My friend Jono Vandor, I do a lot of research. We do shows together. Jono discovered a reference in the Talmud where the rabbis actually bring this up, that at the time there would have been blessings as well. So it's not like this is something no one has ever noticed, the missing blessings. They're not missing, they're in the Moses scroll. How about that?
Let's take a look at this next super chat.
All right.
Rex Profanus, thank you for that big super chat. Really appreciate it. "Merry Christmas. This is the best channel I watched after learned of the Flavians and wanted breakdowns of Christian literature. Thanks for the content." Well, thank you, Rex, and Merry Christmas back at you.
Thanks, Rex. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, this is amazing. So basically, the Moses scroll is missing what it should be missing, and the way it looks is what it should look like if it is authentic. And it goes back to antiquity.
It certainly lends itself to that possibility in a very big way. Just like you said, again, the reason I got into all this was I was questioning, what did Moses actually write? Assuming there's a Moses, I believe there's a Moses. So the question is, if he wrote, because some say, well, if he was here, he was probably illiterate. I don't believe that either. But let's say he wrote something, and then what I find in the text, there are 7 examples. I go into these in the book. There's 7 examples of Moses writing something. So before I heard about Shapira, before I knew about the scroll, I kind of had a framework. I'm looking for Moses wrote commandments. Moses wrote the blessings and curses. Moses wrote this. He wrote. When I find this text and I read it, I'm like, that it matches. Like you go, yep, check, check, check. So the lecture that I gave in April about finding the hand of Moses, my view when I found this scroll, when I read it for the first time, I was like with my mouth open, because I'm thinking, what are the chances that this document, I mean, the whole thing seemed bizarre. And Tabor's story about how he came, he tells it, he wrote the foreword in my book. And, when he's in higher education, he gets the standard view, well, Shapira was a forger. He did this, he did that. In fact, you say Shapira, the forger. He tells a story in the foreword, Jacob, where he's preparing for advanced degrees, and he's studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he's trying to learn to read the ancient scripts. And the professor who's working with him, he's telling this young Dr. Tabor, all about the scrolls. And Tabor asked him, were there any other scrolls, Professor? And he tells James, well, there are a few accounts of scrolls that were discovered near Jericho, and they're written about here and here. And oh, and by the way, there is the story of the Shapira forgery. So Tabor kind of puts this in his mind as the way you think about it. And then you fast forward in history, he kind of filed it away. And then, he keeps up with the field like most people in his field. So he hears every once in a while about different documents, but he finds himself on a plane. I don't want to give the whole thing away because he writes it better than I can tell you, but he finds himself on an airplane with a colleague of his, and the guy brings up, in fact, it's Dr. Shimon Gibson brings up, hey, what do you think about Shapira? And then, fast forward to a little bit later, and then this Tegay thing comes out. What we're looking at now, by the way, Jacob, is a map that I had designed for the book. Daniel Wright put this together for me. You'll notice in the upper left, you'll see Qumran in the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. This is where these documents were discovered. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as we call them now. Scrolls from the Judean wilderness is probably a more accurate designation because they're not all found right there. But anyway, so this is 1946-47 where the scrolls are discovered at Qumran. That's on the west side. Now look to the east and you'll see on the right-hand side of the picture, Wadi Mujib, also Arnon River. What we know from the accounts described by Shapira, we have 4 different accounts of the discovery. Everything we read says that they were discovered in the Wadi Mujib, high up in the Wadi, and then we get 2 other geographical references that I'm going to tell you today, Dibon and Aurora. Both of these places give us sort of a triangulation, the ability to triangulate where the scroll was actually found. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit of a fun story. I was just in Jordan on a tour, leading a tour with Jono Vandor. By the way, we're going back on we lead the Tanakh tour. Your viewers can find it, TanakhTours.com. But we were on the last one. This was just in November. I didn't get home until the day before Thanksgiving, which is a good way to do it, by the way. You fly in, you eat, and you sleep. But we were in this area, and we were bringing the tour group, which we'll do again on the next one, through the Wadi Mujib. We're coming up as we begin to make our way up. I'm telling everyone on the bus, hey, look for caves. I've been here with the Tylers and Jono, and we've been looking. This older gentleman on the bus said, hey, Ross, there's a cave right there. So he points out this cave at this not to be described location, Jacob. And I say, stop the bus, stop the bus. I get out and with my Arab guide, and we talk about it. And I said, I really want to go in that cave because, I mean, looks a little bit treacherous to get in it, but I really want to hike up there. But I got a bus full of people waiting on me. So we see a Bedouin with about 100 sheep. And I asked my guide to ask the shepherd in Arabic, hey, can my friend go in the cave? And he said, yes. Well, I was going to go down into this wadi and make my way up. And he said, no, take the trail. He's telling my guide in Arabic. So I go in the cave, and inside this cave, I haven't released any of this yet. I have plans to maybe share it with some of the people who support my research later, but mainly not as a money-making scam, but I just don't want to give it away, But we go in this cave and we find, first of all, it's massive, and we find what appear to be a shelf in the back, and at least one story that was proposed to me by another scholar that he says he thinks he remembers reading is that the manuscript strips, when the Bedouin found them in the 1860s, that it was described as being on a shelf in the cave. So the question is, did I find the cave? I don't know. The jury is still out on that. But remember, when this was discovered when it comes before the academic world in 1883, they say there's no way that a leather manuscript is going to survive for thousands of years. Then look back to your left again, you see Qumran. Well, that pretty much shoots that theory in the foot, doesn't it? Because now we know that leather manuscripts can survive. They also thought it was silly that it was wrapped in linen, which at one point they were confused. They thought maybe there were mummy strips and maybe the linen was transferred from a mummification thing. But guess what? Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are wrapped in linen. And then they thought, well, even if it could survive and written on leather and wrapped in linen, why would it have bitumen or this black substance on it? Well, guess what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls? 1946, 47, beyond, when scrolls are coming forward, some of them have this black gelatin-like substance on them, which some scholars now propose is part of the decaying of the flesh, and not so much that they were slathered with asphalt or bitumen. But nonetheless, again, in the 1880s, if you're a forger, you're not going to know, unless you're psychic too, Jacob, unless he somehow could say, oh, I can tell they're going to find these, and what are they going to look like? I'm going to make my forgery just like it. I mean, come on. Every detail that was used to discredit it, I won't say every, but many, were shot down. Here's another example. In 1883, they look at the strip. Remember the graphic that you showed earlier where Ganneau says it was cut from the bottom of a scroll? Because this strip, the manuscript was only 4 inches tall, roughly. They give it in centimeters. So from 7.9 to 9.7 centimeters, roughly 4 inches. That led to the theory that it was cut. The forger cut the bottom margin off of a modern scroll. Well, one of the things that's interesting is that when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, several of these scrolls match roughly the dimensions of the Shapira scroll. Namely, there's a Leviticus scroll that was found. Now, Shlomo Gil is a brilliant researcher. Shlomo Gil, G-U-I-L. He's from Israel. He's written quite a bit on Shapira and was one of the people that inspired me in my search. And to this day, he's brilliant. He wrote a document that everyone should read, where he argues for authenticity of Shapira. He's one of the first that really kind of broke the ground on this in the recent years. And he shows many similarities between Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts and the descriptions that we have of Shapira's manuscript. Shlomo Gil, you can look him up on Academia. A lot of his articles are there. But he's written for the Palestine Exploration Fund and other documents. I footnote him extensively, by the way. Now, one more time, Jacob, I know I'm running you crazy, but the drawing that Ginsburg commissioned of the scroll that you had up earlier, notice in that drawing, it's shown in an arch. And what's fascinating about that is, in a way, it disproves Ginsburg's theory, and Tegay and others that have taken this up. It's like you couldn't fake this arch, and you certainly wouldn't cut it off, because then how do you shrivel up one side of it to make it form that arch shape? And why in the world would you? Well, Shlomo Gil shows, and I put some of this evidence in my book, that now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, go look. You can go look on the internet, type in images of Dead Sea Scrolls, and many of these scrolls have that same arch. That's another drawing. What Daniel Wright did there, he took some of the drawings that we had, and he recreated this image for my book. Again, this is called Fragment E among aficionados of this type of stuff. Very few, we call ourselves Shapira maniacs or Shapirologists. But this is Fragment E, contains the Shema on the right and the 10 words left of that in columns 2, 3, 4 of Fragment E. But that arch shape. Now, one other thing, if you look at, you see how the bottom is a little bit cleaner. The top has got a little bit of a jagged edge to it. What the people who suggested it was cut from a modern scroll, they said, look at this. The one side of this shows a clean edge, like a razor knife. You know, like Shapira or whoever forged it, cut it from a modern scroll. The other edge is just deteriorated over time or whatever. But I challenge your viewers, Jacob, to go look at images of these scrolls on the web. There are plenty of images, you know, and you'll see that that's not unusual at all. Look at the Isaiah scroll. It could be deteriorated on one side versus the other based on how it was maybe sitting or, you know, resting on the ground, or who knows. But the evidence, both external, you know, there's some photographs from the British Library's file, 41294. This is photographs of the actual manuscript leather strips. You can see, again, a clean edge, and you can see various details, a seam in one place where two strips or two columns are attached together. But what you can't see, unfortunately, from these photographs from the 1800s is you can't see the text. They just didn't turn out in the photograph, and so that's unfortunate. So all we have presently are transcriptions of the manuscript. Yeah.
I think we didn't look at slide 11 yet. Let me pull that up.
Okay. All right. This obviously is the Siloam inscription. And by the way, there are a lot of interesting discussions going on in the academic world today. I mean, like right now, about the Siloam inscription, the Hezekiah's tunnel. This was discovered in 1880 by a young boy by the name of Jacob Eliyahu, and who was a student of Conrad Schick. And what we find, and the reason this is important, is because Moses Shapira is involved in the debate around the Siloam inscription. Now, there are some people who attack the authenticity of the Shapira strips, and one of their attacks is they say, well, the script resembles, and even some of the orthography, some of the spelling in the scroll match the Siloam inscription. And what they do is they say, wait, Shapira brings the scroll to the attention of the European scholars in 1883. The Siloam inscription is discovered in 1880. So they automatically say, Shapira used the Mesha stela and the Siloam inscription to model his scroll off of. We're on to you, Shapira. But what they fail to recognize is we have evidence, and I mean literally we have the letters, where Shapira sends a note in 1878 to a scholar in Germany by the name of Constantine Schlotman. Schlotman writes back and jumps all down his throat and, like, why are you saying this is authentic? And so we have evidence that he had the text in 1878. Siloam inscription is discovered in 1880. One thing that's important is that after Schlotman writes his letter to Shapira saying, how dare you say that this is an authentic scroll of Moses, Shapira feels badly because he wants to be a believer, a fundamentalist in a way. So he takes the scroll fragments in 1878, October, he puts them in a bank where he leaves them for 5 years. Now, during that 5 years, this is 1878, 1880, the Siloam inscription is discovered. Shapira is part of the debate on this. Now, he's a talented scholar. Most people don't give him credit for this. But not only is Shapira, and I document this, not only is he the first one to ascertain, to determine that this is a record of the builders, saying that it, because your viewers probably know, Siloam inscription describes how 2 teams of builders were working towards one another, cutting this tunnel, one brother, and then calling to the other, and they met in the middle. Shapira is the first one to say, this is what it says. And we have record in contemporary documents where he's given the hat tip for that. The other thing is Shapira looked at this text and he discerned that in line 5, it says 1,200 cubits, and everyone else said it said 1,000. But now we know that Shapira was right, and he was people laughed at him and made fun of him in the 1880s. I remember reading one where one of the other scholars tells Shapira, you stick to studying Talmudic literature and leave this to the real scholars. But now we know he's right. So again, one of the claims against Shapira, people were very critical of him. He's not formally trained to, assess the legitimacy of a scroll or not. Well, they said the same thing about the Siloam inscription, and no one knows this, but he was right. Now, I'm presenting a paper at the Albright Institute in February that's going to make this point, among others. It's about Conrad Schick and his world. It's going to be at the Albright Institute in February of 2023. And part of that is going to be to show Conrad Schick's contributions to our understanding the decipherment of the Siloam inscription. But I'm never going to miss an opportunity to say, oh, and by the way, a former student of Conrad Schick by the name of Moses Shapira was the first to understand and properly interpret the Siloam inscription's message. And he was the only one initially to read it correctly and read 1,200 cubits instead of 1,000. Again, Jacob, for your viewers, people can Google Galil, Galil, Professor Galil out of Haifa University in Israel. He and an archaeologist by the name of Eli Shukran just announced last week that in Hezekiah's tunnel and in the Canaanite pool and in the area directly south of Hezekiah's tunnel, as it's called, they claim to have found 5 new monumental inscriptions dating back, they're claiming, to the biblical period. And according to Galil, in a communication I had with him back and forth on messaging, and then he later published this, it's out there, you can Google it. He says that one of these inscriptions in the Canaanite pool actually mentions Hezekiah by name. Now, the academic world is, the verdict is still out. It's not been formally published. It's not been vetted through any academic journals, like we should do. But just to let people know, this is in the news again, you might say. The Siloam inscription. My new book is about this subject, by the way. The Siloam inscription takes a front seat because I'm telling you, this is a mystery just like this other, sort of an archaeological thriller from the 1880s again. So
let's take a look at this next one. Okay, it's in slide 16. There it is.
Yep, that's the Moabitica I talked about. Specimens, these Moabitica that were discovered on the heels of the Mesha stone or the Moabite stela. All these treasures started appearing in Shapira's shop. He begins to get these in April of 1871. And of course, initially, now remember 1871, the scroll hadn't come forward. It's about 3 years after the discovery of the Mesha stone. And what this does is Shapira brings these forward to the world. Now you can see where I'm going with this. And the Germans are very interested, as are the English. We have Claude Condor, we have Drake, we have other scholars are going to Jerusalem to see Shapira's latest archaeological antiquities that are on display in his shop. And so when they go in there, some of these scholars, Condor in particular, made water prints, like beautiful watercolors that he sent to the PEF in London and said, hey, check this out. Moabitica culture is found in the deserts of Moab, in Transjordan. And what ends up happening is the Germans catch wind of this. Shapira's wife is German, all sorts of interconnectedness here to this story. But ultimately, the Germans, through a pastor, decide we want to buy these. And Konstantin Schlotman, I mentioned earlier in the discussion, he is a professor at Halle University. He catches wind of this, sees the drawings, becomes convinced that they're authentic. So he begins to publish papers about this Moabitica culture, this Moabite culture, that it's right on the heels of the Moabite stone. We have all these things coming to earth. We're going to really invest our time and energy into understanding this ancient people. Now, you can see paleo writing on a couple of these figures. And by the way, these are just a few of the Moabitica. And I will say as a warning that if people decide to Google Moabitica and they look at images, don't have small children around because, or if you're very modest, because some of these were quite grotesque. And let's just leave it at that. but they were sexual in nature, some of these. So just be careful. But anyway, so ultimately, Shapira brings these to Germany. The Germans want to buy them. He brings some to them, and he says, look, before I sell these to you, you have your experts look at them. They said, we want them. We want all you can find. He said, yeah, but I'm not selling them until you give me the stamp of approval from your experts. These came to my possession, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, they force him. They say, just as many as you can find. So Shapira has a guy working with him called Salim al-Qari. Now, Salim is a fascinating character people meet in my book. He's a Bedouin guy, an Arab guy who works with Shapira, but he's involved in the Moabite stone. He's involved here with these Moabitica. He's involved in many, many things, and I'm just discovering new things he's involved in. Long of the short of it is, as we say in Hebrew, beketzer. In short, ultimately, Clermont-Ganneau blows the whistle, calls all of these fake. Now, by this time, Shapira has sold to the Prussians 1,700 of these to the tune of about $400,000 in today's money. Once they're declared a forgery, again, this is the early to mid 1870s, Shapira, even though he was never fingered or pointed at as the forger himself, he's associated with this great forgery known as the Moabitica. That's another book I'm working on called The Moabitica Scandal. But I won't get to that for a couple of years, maybe. But imagine that's discovered in Moab. 1870s, all this is going on. 1878, Shapira's knocking again. Hey, guys, I have an ancient discovery from Moab. What do you think the Germans are going to say, Jacob? They're going to say, you got us once, baby. You're telling me you found another. We already been through this with the Moabitica. We spent 400 grand, 1,700 thayers to buy 22,000 thayers to buy 1,700 pieces of what later became called false. And you want to tell us you found an ancient scroll and it's from Moab? Get out of here. So they were quick to dismiss. But what I find is that German piece of the information is overlooked by many. It's what I'm writing about now. I put a chapter in my book called The German Scholars, and I think that's some of the more important evidence about the authenticity, actually. And I know why they had to come out with this isn't real. Imagine getting burned as big as they were with the Moabitica, now we're going to buy the scroll? Oh yeah, we're going to fall for that. I don't think so, Shapira. Get out of here. Go to England, boy.
Did he try to explain to him that this is that the scroll's a different situation, and it's just because he was, but they're pulling a guilty by association fallacy, in other words.
That's right, and that's the case today, Jacob. I mean, again, people no longer do they have the argument against the scroll that it couldn't survive in a cave. That's out. It wouldn't be wrapped in linen. It wouldn't have paleo. It wouldn't have interpunks. All those arguments are gone. So what do they say? A lot of the scholars who work against it say, number one, guilty by once a forger, always a forger. How many times you have to be a forger to be a forger? The most likely answer to a new discovery is, what did it look like when same guy, same area? Come on. But yeah, that's what's so amazing. People won't even give it a chance. Now, here's what's funny. I know that you interview a lot of scholars. Some of the scholars now, Charlesworth, Dr. Charlesworth, made a comment, and he's a fan of the Shapira scroll. Here's what he says. I don't want to overcommit. What he does say is, he said, he told James Tabor and I in the airport in Tel Aviv, we ran into him. We're doing an investigative trip, and Tabor runs into him, and Charlesworth says, "You know it's authentic, don't you?" Now, why does he say that? What Charlesworth, one of the things that he wrote to me is, we've seen some of the forgeries associated with Shapira, clearly forgeries, and this isn't anything like that. In other words, he said if it would have been a forgery, it would have been by Shapira. It wouldn't have been this good. And there are things, again, any Dead Sea Scroll scholar would know that the similarities are just uncanny. So the question becomes, is the manuscript, did Moses write this? No, not this, because we have two copies. But what I propose is that the underlying manuscript, whereby we have two copies, or from which we have two copies, this is the safe way to say it, represents an early strata of the development of the text. That's what I would propose. That's what Don Dershowitz proposes. Now, that's me trying to be a little more academically reserved. I believed that the Pentateuch has memories of a scroll that Moses wrote. And it mentions 7 times Moses wrote this. I think there's a reason the writer, the editor, the redactor is telling us that there are these memories of what that document consisted of. Deuteronomy 31 tells us he wrote it to the very end, gave it to the Levites, etc. So I think what is described therein, interestingly enough, fits the bill when you look at what this manuscript contains. To me, that's a big, big deal. There are too many, let's call them coincidences, for me not to give weight to this document. Again, I recognize, Jacob, that until we find it, I'm going to say it like that, until we find this and bring it forward and get it scientifically tested. Look, you do the DNA on it and you say, Ross, I'm sorry to tell you, but the goat that this skin came off of was born in 1876. If it's an 1876 model goat, bets off. But guess what? If that's the case, Jacob, I'm going to write another book about the greatest psychic forger that the world has ever known. Because he had to, there's just no way. Again, so when I say I believe it's ancient and authentic, I think that the evidence, the preponderance of evidence, to me, ruled out the possibility of forgery. The internal evidence from a critical view of the Pentateuch shows that there are memories of something that a Moses actually wrote. And when you compare the two, it just so happens that they match. So in the title of the book, The Moses Scroll, it's a little bit tricky because it is the Moses Scroll, one way or the other. The question that's left for your viewers to decide is it the scroll that Moses wrote, as in the son of Amram, or is it the scroll that Moses Shapira wrote? It's the scroll of Moses, one way or the other. Now, Moses Shapira argued, he said, I don't think it's a forgery, and but we don't think he wrote it either way now. The evidence seems to suggest that even if, and I'm willing to say this under duress, that even if it's a forgery, Shapira didn't do it. Dershowitz proves that. I think. But man, I'm telling you, there's just a lot of evidence.
Do you think that an approximate reconstruction could be done on what Moses may have written by comparing the Moses scroll to the Pentateuch?
Yeah, at least in my mind. Now, again, I know that minimalist would laugh at that whole question you just posed to me, but I'm not a minimalist. A minimalist. What I would suggest is that within the Pentateuch we have traces. We have an evolution of the actual text. Again, this is my view. And that it gives away certain clues as to what that original text looked like. Let me tell you what wouldn't be in it. That's easier. Dead people don't write. So Moses would not describe his own death. And I know that might be a little bit challenging or harsh to a fundamentalist, but I'm just trying to make the point. Anachronisms wouldn't exist. Moses is not going to write in Exodus chapter 16 about how manna came to the children of Israel for 40 years. And you realize that Exodus 16 is written at a time before they even reached Sinai. So you have anachronisms in the text. If you could find what Moses wrote, it wouldn't have Moses, the meekest man in all the earth, describing Moses in the third person as the meekest man in all the earth. You wouldn't have Moses, who never crossed onto the west side of the Jordan, writing about things that Moses, said on the east side of the Jordan from the perspective of someone viewing it from the west. On and on and on. You wouldn't have the Lord spoke unto Moses in something Moses wrote. You would have the Lord spoke unto me. We get traces of this in Deuteronomy, which makes me believe that the way that this original, let's call it the original scroll that let's call it the Moses scroll. How about that? When Moses wrote his scroll, to the very end, Deuteronomy 31, still has 3 chapters left, he rolls it up, gives it to the Levites for safekeeping, and it's hidden. It's lost basically until the days of Josiah for all intents and purposes. You read through and I cover this in the book, but you read through the text, people, you can't come away with the view, if you read the book of Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd King, you don't get the image that this is like a real obedient people that are making sure they don't violate. Let me get make sure I'm doing this right. Not at all. It's like they don't even know what the text says. In fact, when the scroll of Moses is found, Hilkiah comes to Shaphan. He says, we found the scroll that Moses wrote. The scroll that Moses wrote. So I think if we pull all this together, what are the clues that we get internal to the text? What would that scroll contain? I think I've identified 7 things that the text says that Moses wrote. I think that when we read the story of Josiah and the discovery, I think it's embellished a little bit, but I think we get some evidence of what that text contained based on the actions and response of Josiah in his religious reforms. And every one of those clues point us to a form of the book of Deuteronomy. Every one, like no exception. You don't get the idea that, well, maybe he's quoting this or that. It all points to Deuteronomy, which is why some scholars say that Deuteronomy is a pious fraud, that it wasn't discovered in that day, it was written in that day. So could we reconstruct the scroll that Moses actually wrote? You could say yes and no. I think we can get a good working hypothesis, if that's fair, of what it wouldn't contain versus what we have. And you could get sort of a framework. And that's what I was working on when I had this idea to write this other book that never happened. And then when I find a scroll that someone else had already found, already dismissed as a forgery, that contained those elements, I said, wait a minute. Then you start saying, so this has been my entire quest for a couple of years now, and then just out of nowhere, come on. I mean, some might say, well, it's just a coincidence. Well, it's a mighty big coincidence. You start ticking it off. I think that the manuscript that Moses wrote would certainly be in the first person. It would be written from a perspective east of the Jordan, not west. It would contain first-person material and no third, no anachronisms, things like that. And I would even propose that, in the Pentateuch, we have a problem with the name. Part of the JEPD, when you talk about the documentary hypothesis, a lot of people don't really know a lot about that. But one thing they do know is, well, J uses the tetragrammaton, whereas E doesn't. So that's all they really know. But they don't know there's a subtle nuance there that most people miss. Exodus chapter 6. In Exodus chapter 6, Moses is in a conversation with God. And God says, by my name, Yod He Vav He, I was not known to the fathers, but by my name, El Shaddai. Now that's interesting. Exodus chapter 6, verse 2 and 6:3. What's interesting about that is if you go back to Genesis chapter 4, if you go back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, between Genesis 2:3 and Exodus 6:2, you have hundreds of occurrences. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but you have a lot of occurrences of the divine name. And Moses tells us that he came to know the name in his day, or actually the Pentateuch tells us, has God telling Moses they didn't know it. Now, people try to get around that, and it becomes sort of a debate between fundamentalist and minimalist and, maximalist, I guess. But what's interesting is many scholars believe that the Elohist version of the story of the Pentateuch dates, it's not, maybe not the earliest, but one of the earliest. And E and J, certainly they come before P and D. But what if, and Shapira entertained this, he was shocked when he realized that in the body of the text, the tetragrammaton never occurs. It always uses Elohim, even where you would expect it to have the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, Yod He Vav He, Jehovah or Yahweh, as some would say. It doesn't occur anywhere. So he speculates, he goes, wait a minute, could it be that we have a early version, an Elohist version of a text here? Now, scholars kind of laughed him, off the stage there, but at least one scholar said that's the most clever thing about this forgery, is that it doesn't use the name. Now, why does he say that? Because academia had already kind of determined that that's an early strata of the text, that the divine name, Yod He Vav He, comes in late. So the fact that, this is Neubauer says, the fact that Shapira, or whoever forged it, used only the term Elohim, that he thought was pretty clever. And so I think that, when we look at what would it contain, I know that people say, well, this is just an exercise in futility because of all the reasons the minimalists would give us that you're wasting your time. But I'm not wasting anything. I'm having the time of my life tracking down these details, and the circumstantial evidence at some point becomes you reach a tipping point. And that's why when I finished Tegay's book, please don't get me wrong, Tegay is a brilliant writer. I'm telling you, I didn't stop. I couldn't put his book down. But at the end of it, when he concludes he can't find the manuscript, which was the goal of his book, and he's got to come up with something because his publisher's going, hey, let's go. I got to get this out. He ultimately has to come away with an ending, and the ending is that it's a forgery. He comes out with the same basic story that Clermont-Ganneau and others have. It's cut from the bottom of a scroll. And now he claims to have seen a manuscript that was that passed through Shapira that had a portion of it removed. Well, is that the smoking gun? Well, it could be, but only if you have enough of that scroll cut to produce, this manuscript. I mean, if it's a strip cut, is it 7 feet long? Is it 12 inches long? What is it? And Idan Dershowitz has done some effective work to counter that, not to question the integrity of Hanan Tegeh. Yes, you probably saw a scroll that had a piece missing, but we also know that that very scroll had water damage and a piece was cut out, perhaps to keep that mildew or whatever from spreading through the rest of it. Sort of a preservation thing, you know. So, but it's like every theory that's been put forward to shoot this down has fallen up short, in my opinion, and in the opinion of others, you know, Idan Dershowitz. I don't like to speak for what other scholars' views are, but I know James very well, and as a biblical scholar, he's not going to claim, yeah, this is the scroll that Moses wrote, or this is, he's going to be reserved too, but he will say, the preponderance of evidence seems to suggest that there is a really strong case that this is an ancient document and authentic, meaning not like you can't find Moses's hand in it, but it probably is early. And there are other scholars who put forward that it's ancient and authentic, but they don't bring in what I do with textual criticism and how it might reflect an early evolution of the Pentateuch. Long rambling answer, I know, but I get excited about it.
Well, it is exciting. And I thank you for joining me today.
I appreciate you having me, and thanks to all the viewers who stayed with us this long.
Yes, and I thank the super chats for their questions. It really helps me continue this channel and my work. And yes, thank you again, Ross. I would love to have you back at some point. Maybe even with Charles Worth and Tabor together, if they're open to the idea.
Sounds good. And I can't speak for them, but I can tell you I'm in.
Thanks again.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.